The room was so quiet, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. Only the beeping of the machines broke the silence, echoing in the sterile air. David sat in the chair beside his son's bed, his body slumped with the weight of exhaustion. James lay motionless, tubes connected to him, his chest rising and falling mechanically with the aid of the ventilator. It had been 2 weeks since the accident, 2 weeks since a drunk driver veered into James's path and left him fighting for his life. David hadn't left the hospital for more than a few hours at a time. His faith stretched thinner with every passing day. He prayed constantly, begged, even, hoping for a miracle, but the doctors were not optimistic. Prepare for the worst, they had said. David's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he couldn't close them. Every time he did, he imagined the worst. James slipping away in the night, leaving him to face a world without his son. His heart ached with the thought of it. He had lost his wife, and 5 years ago to cancer. Losing James would break him. "Please," David whispered, his voice cracking in the stillness. "Please, God, don't take him from me." The words felt hollow, as if they were swallowed by the emptiness in the room. David clenched his fists, his knuckles white, and lowered his head, trying to focus on the rhythm of James's breathing. In, out, in, out. He couldn't give up, not yet. He had to believe that there was still hope. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and the night deepened. The nurse came and went, checking the machines, adjusting the tubes, offering David a sad, sympathetic smile. But no one could offer him what he truly needed. No one could give him his son back. It was in that hollow quiet that something changed. At first, David thought he had imagined it. A voice, soft and barely audible, whispered in the room. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Everything will be all right." The words hung in the air, sending a chill down his spine. He looked around, his heart pounding. The room was empty, just him and James, the machines quietly beeping. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky beneath him. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. But there was no reply. The room returned to its suffocating silence. David shook his head, his pulse racing. It must have been exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Or maybe it was just wishful thinking, a desperate hope trying to manifest itself. He sank back into the chair, his hands trembling. He didn't know if he had imagined it, or if he was losing his grip on reality. But one thing was certain, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The following night, David returned to James's room, the lingering echo of the voice haunting him. He had barely slept, his mind spinning in circles, replaying the words over and over again. Could it have been real? Was it a sign? Or had he truly imagined it? Sitting in the same chair as before, David stared at James, his son's face pale and still beneath the harsh hospital lights. He prayed silently, his heart filled with desperation. Every minute that passed without improvement felt like a small death, chipping away at his hope. Hours trickled by, and once again, the night deepened. David's head drooped, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. His eyelids fluttered shut for just a moment, and then, "Everything will be all right." David's eyes snapped open, and his heart leapt into his throat. There it was again, the voice, calm, soothing, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. He bolted upright, scanning the room. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, his voice shaky. Silence. But this time, David didn't feel as if he were alone. It was as if the room was filled with a presence, something unseen, but palpable. His pulse raced, and he felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. The voice didn't return, but the air felt thick with meaning, as though something hung in the balance. David sat in tense silence, his mind reeling. He wanted to believe it was a sign, a message from somewhere beyond, offering him a shred of hope. But his rational mind fought against it. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. "Am I going crazy?" David muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes. His nerves were frayed, and the weight of 2 weeks without real rest pressed down on him. Maybe he was just imagining things, clinging to hope in the only way his mind could. But then, something unexpected happened. As David stared at James's face, he saw it. Just for a moment, a twitch of the eyelids, a flutter so small it was almost imperceptible. His breath caught in his throat. "James," he whispered, leaning forward, his heart pounding. "James, can you hear me?" But there was no response, no further movement. David felt a surge of frustration and grief, his hands balling into fists. Was it real, or had his mind played tricks on him again? He didn't know what to believe anymore. But deep down, in the pit of his soul, he felt something stir. The voice, the twitch, it had to mean something. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't over yet. The next morning, David felt like he was walking through a fog. The hospital halls were bright with the early light of the day, but inside, he was still trapped in the heaviness of the night. The voice, the flicker of movement, it all lingered with him, pulling at his thoughts like a persistent shadow. After a brief conversation with the doctors, who had nothing new to report, he returned to James's room. As he stood over his son's bed, staring at his motionless body, David felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Was he foolish for believing the voice meant something? Was the twitch just a fluke? He sat down, his hands folded in his lap, and waited. Hours stretched on, and as nurses came and went, David barely registered their presence. His focus was solely on James. Every time the machines beeped or a muscle twitched, David's heart leapt, only to sink again when nothing more happened. By the afternoon, his mind was racing. The doctors hadn't seen the twitch, hadn't heard the voice. They didn't believe James would recover. But David clung to the faintest shred of hope, feeding it with his faith. He whispered softly to James, his words barely audible, "I know you can hear me. I know you're in there." Another hour passed, and then it happened again. A subtle twitch of James's eyelids, just like before. David shot up from his chair, his pulse quickening. This time, he was sure he hadn't imagined it. He rushed to the side of the bed, his hands shaking. "James, come on, wake up," he urged, his voice trembling with both hope and fear. But again, there was nothing more. The twitch was gone as quickly as it came, leaving David standing there, desperate and confused. Could it be a sign that James was coming back to him? Or was his mind playing cruel tricks, giving him false hope? The voice from the night echoed in his head. "Everything will be all right." David collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands. He didn't know what to think anymore. Every doctor told him to prepare for the worst. Yet here he was, seeing what felt like a spark of life. How could he give up now? Was it enough to keep believing? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. He would be here, watching, waiting. He wouldn't leave his son's side, not until he knew for sure. As the days passed, the uncertainty gnawed at David. The doctors insisted that the twitching was likely just a reflex, a meaningless movement that had no connection to consciousness. But David couldn't accept that. Every time he saw the subtle flicker of James's eyelids, or a twitch of his fingers, his heart soared. To him, they were signs, a message that James was still there, fighting to come back. The voice had not returned, but its words haunted him. Every night, David would sit in the dim hospital room, listening for it, waiting. He prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life, begging God for a sign, for something more to prove that James would pull through. His family started to visit less frequently. They were worried about him, worried that his hope was turning into delusion. His brother, Michael, was the first to confront him about it. One afternoon, as David sat by James's bed, Michael entered the room with a heavy sigh. "David, we need to talk," Michael said, his tone gentle but firm. David barely glanced up. "Not now. It can't wait," Michael insisted, pulling up a chair beside him. "I've been talking to the doctors. They're concerned. And so am I." David's jaw tightened. "They don't know everything. I know you want to believe there's hope, but you've been here for weeks, and there's no improvement. You're running yourself into the ground." David finally turned to face his brother, his eyes hollow and dark from lack of sleep. "I've seen things, Michael. I've seen him move. I've heard something. I'm not giving up on him." Michael's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. "I know you're hurting. I know you want a miracle. But maybe it's time to think about letting go. Letting go? David's voice cracked, a mix of anger and pain surging through him. How can I let go when I know there's still a chance? Michael placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice lowering. I'm worried about you. You're not thinking clearly. This isn't good for you. David shrugged off his brother's hand, his chest tight with emotion. I won't give up on my son. With that, Michael stood, his face drawn with worry. Just think about it, David. Please. As Michael left the room, David's heart sank. He knew his family was worried, but how could they understand what he was feeling? They didn't see what he saw. They didn't hear the voice. To them, this was just the end of the line. But to David, it was far from over. As night fell again, David sat in the dark, his heart heavy with doubt. He needed a sign, something more to hold on to. His faith, once so strong, was now wavering under the weight of reality. Please, he whispered into the void. Give me something. Anything. But the room remained silent, and for the first time, David wondered if he was truly losing his grip on reality. David had barely slept the night before, the weight of his brother's words and his own doubt pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He had returned home briefly to grab a change of clothes, but the house felt so empty without James. Every corner, every photo on the wall, reminded him of his son and of Anne. It had been 5 years since Anne's death, but the pain of losing her still sat heavy in his chest, as raw as the day she was taken by cancer. She had always been the strong one, the one with unshakable faith. David had leaned on her strength when his own wavered, but now, without her, he felt lost. It was just him and James, or at least it had been. As he moved through the house, picking up a few things, something caught his eye. A small, worn envelope, yellowed with time, poked out from beneath a stack of books on the coffee table. Frowning, David picked it up. His breath caught in his throat when he saw Anne's handwriting on the front. For David and James. His fingers trembled as he carefully opened the envelope, revealing a folded letter inside. The paper was fragile, and he unfolded it with care. The moment he saw the first few lines, written in Anne's neat, precise hand, his heart clenched. Dear David, if you're reading this, it means something has happened. I wrote this letter because I've had a dream, one that I can't ignore. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I need to tell you about it, just in case. David's eyes skimmed over the next few lines, his pulse quickening as he read, and described a dream she'd had just weeks before her death, a vivid dream where James was hurt, injured badly in an accident. In the dream, James was in the hospital, and the doctors didn't believe he would survive. But Anne described a voice, soft and calm, telling her that James would wake up, that everything would be all right. David's hands shook as he continued reading. I know it sounds strange, but the voice was so real, so clear. It told me not to give up hope, that James would pull through even when it seemed impossible. I just wanted to write this down, in case you ever needed to hear it. I believe it was a sign, a message from somewhere beyond. By the time he finished the letter, tears blurred David's vision. Anne's words, her belief in something beyond the tangible, mirrored everything David had been feeling. Could this be connected to the voice he had heard in the hospital? Was this the sign he had been waiting for? His mind raced as he clutched the letter to his chest, the edges of doubt beginning to fade. It wasn't just his imagination, and had heard it too, in her dream. He felt her presence with him, as though she had been guiding him all along. David's heart surged with renewed hope. This was the message he had been asking for, the proof that he wasn't losing his mind. He wiped his eyes and stood up, gripping the letter tightly. He needed to get back to the hospital. He needed to be with James. David returned to the hospital with a newfound sense of purpose. The letter from and gave him the strength to face whatever came next, convinced that James's recovery was more than just a distant hope. He shared the contents of the letter with his sister, Sarah, when she arrived to visit. But Sarah's reaction wasn't what he expected. I'm worried about you, David, she said softly, sitting across from him in the hospital waiting room. Her face was drawn with concern, her eyes heavy with sadness. I don't think this is healthy. David frowned, his grip tightening on the letter in his hands. What do you mean? This is proof. And knew something. She had a dream, and she heard the voice too. "This isn't just in my head," Sarah sighed, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "I know you want to believe that, but dreams are just dreams, David. You're exhausted, and you've been sitting in that room for days on end. Of course you're seeing things, hearing things." He pulled his arm away, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You don't understand. This is different. I know what I heard, and now, with this letter, it's all connected. David, I love you. But this isn't the way to deal with losing James." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I haven't lost him. He's still here. He's still fighting." Sarah's eyes softened, but her tone was firm. "David, the doctors have been clear. There's no brain activity. You're holding on to something that isn't real." He stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. But how could she say that? How could she give up so easily when he had seen the twitch, when he had heard the voice? "I won't give up on him," David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "And wouldn't give up on him, and neither will I." Sarah stood as well, her face filled with sympathy, but her words cut deep. "I just don't want to see you hurt any more than you already are." As Sarah left the room, David was left standing alone, the letter still clutched in his hand. The doubt began creeping in again, clawing at the edges of his mind. Was he really losing touch with reality? Was he the only one who believed in something more? But then he looked at James, lying still in the hospital bed, and the memory of Anne's words came rushing back to him. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he was so close to finding out the truth. He returned to the chair beside James's bed, whispering softly as the night began to fall. "I'm here, James. I'm not going anywhere." The machines continued their steady beeping, and the room was quiet again. But David wasn't alone. He had Anne's letter, her faith, and the voice that had whispered to him in the dark. He had to believe. The next few days blurred together, with David barely leaving James's side. Each moment was filled with a fragile hope, the kind that flickered like a weak flame, threatening to be snuffed out at any moment. The letter from and had reignited something in him, something that pushed him to believe that, despite what everyone said, there was still a chance. But as the days stretched on, the outside pressure began to mount. The doctors had been patient with him, but they were growing increasingly insistent. They scheduled a meeting with David, urging him to face the facts. In a small, cold conference room, David sat across from Dr. Patel, the lead physician on James's case, and a few other medical staff. Dr. Patel spoke carefully, his tone gentle but firm. "David, I understand how difficult this is. I've seen this kind of situation more times than I'd like to admit, and it's never easy. But we have to talk about what comes next." David's throat tightened. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to hear it. Dr. Patel glanced at the chart in front of him before looking David in the eye. "We've run every possible test, and unfortunately, there's been no improvement in James's condition. There's no brain activity. Medically, we don't expect him to recover." David's stomach turned, a cold dread settling over him. "There's still time. Sometimes it takes longer." "David," Dr. Patel interrupted softly, his voice filled with empathy. "We've given it time. It's been over 3 weeks now. If there was going to be any sign of recovery, we would have seen it by now." David clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to shake the table and demand they believe what he believed. But instead, he swallowed his anger and forced himself to stay calm. Dr. Patel continued, "We need to start thinking about the next steps. Keeping James on life support indefinitely isn't sustainable. At some point, we have to talk about letting him go." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His vision blurred with anger and grief. He could barely breathe. "I'm not ready for that," David said, his voice hoarse. "I've seen him move. He's still there." "You don't understand." Dr. Patel exchanged a glance with one of the other doctors before responding. "We know this is incredibly hard to accept, but we've seen these kinds of movements before. They're just reflexes. They don't indicate any consciousness." David shook his head, his jaw tight. "You're wrong. He's still in there." Dr. Patel sighed, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not trying to rush you, David, but we do need a decision soon. We can't keep James on life support forever. I understand that you're hoping for a miracle, but we have to face the reality of the situation." David felt a lump forming in his throat. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not giving up on him. I'll never give up on him." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the room, his mind spinning. They didn't understand. They hadn't seen what he'd seen. How could they expect him to make such an impossible decision? He returned to James's room, the steady beeping of the machines filling the silence. His heart ached, but as he looked down at his son, he felt the same spark of hope that had kept him going for weeks. "I'm not letting you go," David whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't care what they say. I know you're still in there." The night was deep and quiet as David sat by James's bed, his mind racing with the doctor's ultimatum. They wanted him to make a decision, but how could he? How could anyone expect him to give up on his son? The room felt suffocating, the steady rhythm of the machines doing little to calm his fraying nerves. His heart was heavy with doubt, but somewhere inside, a flicker of belief remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that the voice and letter and the subtle movements he had seen were all connected. David leaned back in the chair, his eyes fixed on James's still face. His thoughts swirled, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to close his eyes, just for a moment. That was when he heard it. The same voice, soft and calm, whispered in the stillness. "You know what you need to do." David's eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the machines. His pulse quickened as he looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. "You know what you need to do," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. David stood up, his hands shaking. "What do you mean?" he whispered into the darkness. There was no response, just the silence of the room, the hum of the machines, and the faint echo of the voice in his mind. But David knew what it meant. The voice had been guiding him all along, and now it was asking him to take a step that terrified him. He approached James's bedside, his heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. The voice had told him everything would be all right. It had given him hope when he had none, but now it was asking for something more, a leap of faith that could change everything. David reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the edge of the ventilator. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. The doctors had made it clear, disconnecting the life support meant the end. But the voice had never lied to him before. Could he trust it now? His heart pounded in his ears as he stood frozen by James's bed, torn between the impossible choice before him. Every rational part of him screamed not to do it, that this was madness, that he was risking everything. But the voice had promised him hope. "You know what you need to do." David's hands hovered over the ventilator, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could barely think, barely breathe. But deep down, in the core of his being, he knew the choice had already been made. "I trust you," David whispered, his voice barely audible. With a trembling hand, he reached for the switch. David's hand hovered over the ventilator switch, trembling with fear. He was frozen between two impossible choices: trust the voice that had promised him everything would be all right, or follow the doctor's orders and give up hope. His breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, but the voice's calm whisper echoed in his mind, urging him to take a leap of faith. He stared down at James, his son's pale face illuminated by the dim hospital lights. His chest rose and fell with the aid of the machines, but the stillness of his body was a painful reminder of the uncertainty that surrounded them both. "I can't lose you," David whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and with trembling hands, flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. The machines hissed softly as the air stopped flowing, and the room seemed to hold its breath alongside him. David's heart pounded in his chest as he waited, praying for a miracle. His hands gripped the edge of the bed, his knuckles white. Then, slowly, James's chest stopped moving. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors shifted, their steady pace faltering as they began to indicate a decline. Panic gripped David's heart, but he remained frozen, unable to look away from his son. "No." David's voice cracked with desperation. "Please no." For a long, agonizing minute, David stood there, staring at James as the machines began to flatline. His breath caught in his throat, and the silence of the room became deafening. The voice had promised him hope, promised him that everything would be all right. But now, all David felt was the crushing weight of grief. His knees buckled, and he sank into the chair beside the bed, his face buried in his hands. His mind screamed at him that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had let the voice deceive him. Tears streamed down his face, and his sobs echoed in the quiet room. Just as despair threatened to consume him completely, something happened. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. David lifted his head, his heart skipping a beat. It was so subtle that he almost missed it, but there it was again, a small, shallow breath. David bolted upright, his eyes wide. He leaned forward, staring at James's face, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. Another breath, and then another. "James," David whispered, his voice trembling with hope. "James, can you hear me?" James's eyelids fluttered, and his chest began to rise and fall on its own. The machines, which had been slowly silencing, now showed a faint but steady heartbeat. David's heart soared as he rushed to the door, calling for the nurses. Within moments, the room was flooded with medical staff, all of them baffled by the sudden change. They worked quickly, checking James's vitals, adjusting the machines, and trying to make sense of what was happening. David stood in the corner, his hands still trembling, watching in stunned disbelief as the doctors and nurses scrambled to stabilize James. It was a miracle, a real, undeniable miracle. James was breathing on his own. The voice had been right. It had told David to trust, and now, as he stood there watching his son come back to life, he realized that he had been given the hope he so desperately sought. The following hours were a blur for David. The hospital staff were in shock, murmuring to one another as they examined James's vitals. He was stable, breathing on his own, and though weak, his condition had improved dramatically. The doctors couldn't explain it. Dr. Patel, who had been the one to deliver the grim prognosis just days before, now stood at James's bedside, flipping through his chart with furrowed brows. He glanced at David, his expression one of cautious optimism. "This kind of recovery is highly unusual," Dr. Patel said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We still need to run tests, but for now, it seems your son is stabilizing." David barely registered the words. He was focused entirely on James, watching as his son's chest continued to rise and fall. His heart swelled with gratitude, but beneath it all was a lingering sense of disbelief. How could something like this happen? Was it truly the result of his faith, or had some other force intervened? Hours passed, and slowly, James's condition improved. His movements became more frequent, his breathing stronger. By the time the sun began to rise, David had barely moved from his chair, his eyes fixed on his son. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was that James was alive. By mid-morning, the hospital staff had finished their tests, and though they remained baffled by the results, they confirmed that James was indeed improving. Dr. Patel approached David again, this time with a slightly more relaxed expression. "We'll need to monitor him closely," he said. "But if this progress continues, there's a good chance he could make a full recovery." David's heart skipped a beat. A full recovery. The words felt almost too good to be true, but as he looked at James, lying peacefully in the bed, he allowed himself to believe it. For the first time in weeks, David felt the weight on his chest lift, the suffocating pressure of uncertainty fading. He had done the unthinkable, trusted in something beyond reason, and now he was being rewarded with the one thing he had wanted most, his son's life. But even as relief washed over him, David couldn't shake the lingering questions in his mind. The voice, the one that had guided him through this ordeal, had been right. But what was it? Was it really a message from God, as he had first believed? Or was it something else entirely? The more he thought about it, the more conflicted he became. Faith had carried him through the darkest moments of his life, and it had led him here, to this miracle. But doubt crept in, unbidden, as he wondered whether he had been right to trust so blindly. The doctors couldn't explain James's recovery, but David knew there had to be an explanation. He just wasn't sure what it was anymore. As the hours passed and James's condition continued to improve, David found himself standing by the window, staring out at the bustling world beyond the hospital walls. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and life carried on as if nothing had happened. But for David, everything had changed. Behind him, James stirred, his fingers twitching slightly. David turned, his heart leaping with joy as he saw his son's eyes flutter open for the first time since the accident. "Dad." James's voice was weak, but it was enough to bring tears to David's eyes. "I'm here, son," David whispered, rushing to his side. "I'm here." James blinked, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "What happened?" David hesitated, unsure how to explain everything that had transpired. How could he put into words the agony, the faith, and the miracle that had saved them both? "It's a long story," David said softly, brushing a hand through his son's hair. "But for now, just rest. You're going to be okay." James nodded slightly, his eyes fluttering shut again as he drifted back to sleep. David sat back in the chair, a deep sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax, knowing that whatever had happened, whatever the voice had been, it had brought his son back to him. The next few days passed in a strange blur for David, filled with equal parts disbelief and overwhelming relief. James's recovery had baffled the doctors. The medical team continued running tests, monitoring every small improvement, but they had no explanation for his sudden progress. The more they tried to rationalize it, the more impossible it seemed. David, however, was beyond the need for explanations. Each day brought more signs of life, more movement, more consciousness. The moments he had longed for were finally unfolding before his eyes. James's fingers would twitch, his eyelids would flutter, and sometimes he would open his eyes just long enough to say a few words before slipping back into a deep sleep. One morning, just before dawn, James stirred again. David was sitting beside him, his own body aching from days of restless vigil, when he heard a soft voice. "Dad." David shot up from his chair, his heart leaping. James's voice was weak, but it was clearer than it had been in days. "I'm here, son," David said, leaning forward, his voice thick with emotion. He squeezed James's hand gently, unable to believe this was finally happening. James blinked slowly, his eyes still adjusting to the light. What happened? David swallowed hard. How could he explain everything? The accident, the coma, the voice that had guided him? He wasn't even sure how much James could understand in his weakened state. He decided to keep it simple, for now. "You were in an accident, James," David said softly, "but you're going to be okay. You're getting stronger every day." James's brows furrowed, and he seemed to be searching his memory for the events that had led him here. His eyes flicked to the tubes, the machines, and his frail body. "I feel tired," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his heart aching at the sight of his son's exhaustion. "That's normal. You've been through a lot. But don't worry, you're going to get better. I promise." James's eyes fluttered shut again, and for a moment, David feared he would slip back into unconsciousness. But after a few moments of silence, James spoke again, his voice even softer this time. I think I heard you." David froze. His pulse quickened as he processed what James had said. "Heard me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "When?" "When I was asleep," James replied, his eyes still closed. "I heard you talking to me, telling me not to give up." David's throat tightened, and he squeezed James's hand gently. "I never gave up, James. I knew you could hear me." James's lips curled into a faint smile, and for the first time in weeks, David felt an overwhelming sense of peace. His son was waking up. He was coming back to him. As James drifted back into sleep, David sat back in the chair, his heart pounding. The miracle was real. James was recovering. The voice that had guided David through the darkest nights had been right all along. Everything was going to be all right. But as the hours passed and David continued to reflect on the events that had unfolded, he couldn't shake the lingering questions. The voice had promised hope, but who or what had it been? Was it Anne, watching over them from beyond? Was it a divine message guiding him when all else seemed lost? Or was it simply the manifestation of his own desperate need for faith? The doctors had no answers, but David knew one thing for certain. He had followed his heart, trusted in something greater than himself, and it had brought his son back. That was enough. James's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, he regained more strength, his body healing from the trauma that had kept him in a coma for so long. The hospital staff, still baffled by his miraculous turnaround, kept a close watch, but as the days passed, the need for constant monitoring lessened. With each improvement, David felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift. His mind, once consumed by doubt and fear, was now filled with hope. The doctors had no medical explanation, but to David, the explanation didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that James was alive and getting better. But while James's physical health was on the mend, David's relationships with those around him were still strained. His family, especially his brother Michael and his sister Sarah, had grown distant during the ordeal. They had tried to convince him to let go, to face the grim reality the doctors had presented. David understood why they had done it. They were trying to protect him from further pain. But now, the rift between them felt palpable. One afternoon, as James rested, Michael arrived at the hospital. David had called him, hoping to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Michael entered the room, his face a mix of relief and hesitation. "Hey," Michael said softly as he approached the bed. "How's he doing?" David stood up, glancing at James, who was sleeping peacefully. "He's doing better. A lot better," Michael nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I still can't believe it. After everything, it's a miracle." David smiled faintly. "Yeah, it is." For a moment, the room was filled with silence. Michael shifted awkwardly, clearly wanting to say more but unsure of how to begin. David decided to break the tension. "I know things have been rough," David said, his voice soft. "You and Sarah were just trying to help. I understand that now." Michael let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "We didn't know what to do, David. We thought we were helping by trying to get you to let go. But I see now that you were right to hold on." David nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. "It wasn't easy. There were times when I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. But I had to believe. I had to hold on to the hope that James would come back." Michael's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to his brother. "You did the impossible, David. You brought him back. I don't know how, but you did." David smiled, feeling the warmth of reconciliation in his brother's words. "I didn't do it alone. I had help." Michael looked at him curiously. "Help? From who?" David hesitated, the memory of the voice still fresh in his mind. He wasn't sure how to explain it, wasn't sure if Michael would understand, but he decided to share anyway. "There was a voice," David began, his voice low. "I heard it, in the hospital. It told me not to give up. It promised that everything would be all right." Michael's brows furrowed in confusion. "A voice?" David nodded, his heart pounding as he tried to find the right words. "I know it sounds crazy, but it was real. It guided me through all of this. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was God, maybe it was Anne. But it was there, and it gave me the strength to keep going." Michael stared at him for a moment, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. But instead of dismissing it, he simply nodded. "Maybe it was something beyond what any of us can understand," Michael said softly. "Maybe faith is all we need to explain it." David smiled, grateful for his brother's open mind. The rift between them was beginning to heal, just like the wounds that had kept James trapped in his coma. Slowly but surely, everything was coming back together. As the days turned into weeks, James's strength continued to grow. The doctors, still baffled by his recovery, eventually discharged him from the hospital, though they insisted on follow-up visits to monitor his progress. David took James home, feeling a mixture of overwhelming relief and quiet disbelief that they had come this far. Life was slowly returning to some semblance of normalcy. But while James recovered physically, David found himself grappling with deeper questions. The voice had guided him through the darkest period of his life, promising hope when all seemed lost. But now that James was home and safe, David was left with the question that had gnawed at him since the moment he heard it. What had it been? Was it truly a divine intervention? Was it a message from and watching over them from beyond? Or had it been his own desperate mind clinging to something to believe in? The uncertainty weighed heavily on him. One afternoon, as James rested upstairs, David found himself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the peaceful street beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the ground. Everything looked so calm, so normal. But inside, David felt anything but calm. His mind kept replaying the moments in the hospital, the voice, the decision to trust it, and the miraculous outcome that followed. He had believed with every fiber of his being that the voice was real, that it was guiding him to save James. And it had worked. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. David's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see James standing in the doorway, looking stronger and healthier than he had in weeks. "Hey, Dad," James said, his voice still a little raspy but full of life. David smiled, his heart swelling with love and relief. "Hey, bud, how are you feeling?" "Better," James replied, walking over to the kitchen table and sitting down. "Tired, but better." David nodded, watching his son closely. There was still a part of him that couldn't believe James was sitting here, alive and recovering. It was a miracle, one that David had prayed for, fought for, and in the end, received. After a few moments of silence, James looked up at his father, his brow furrowed slightly. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course," David said, sitting down across from him. James hesitated, as if unsure how to phrase his question. "When I was in the hospital, before I woke up, did you hear something?" David's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure where James was going with this, but he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." James glanced down at his hands, fidgeting slightly. "I thought I heard it too. A voice. It told me not to give up." David stared at his son, his mind racing. He had never told James about the voice, not in detail. Yet here James was, confirming what David had experienced. The voice hadn't just spoken to him. It had reached James too, in the depths of his coma. David leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did it say, exactly?" James closed his eyes, as if trying to remember the words. "It said, 'You're going to be okay. Just keep fighting.'" I didn't know if it was real or if I was dreaming, but it felt peaceful. David felt a chill run down his spine. The voice had said the same thing to him, in a different way, but the message was the same. It had been there for both of them, guiding them through the darkest moments of their lives. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding. Whatever the voice had been, whether it was divine intervention, a manifestation of their collective hope, or something else entirely, it had been real, and it had saved them. James opened his eyes again, looking at his father with a faint smile. "Do you think it was Mom?" David's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't wanted to voice the possibility, afraid that it would be too painful, too wishful. But now, hearing James ask the question, he felt the truth settle deep in his chest. "I don't know," David said honestly, his voice trembling slightly, "but I think maybe it was." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I like to think it was her, watching out for us." David smiled, his eyes misting over with emotion. "I like to think that too." For the first time in weeks, the heavy questions that had weighed on David's mind seemed to lighten. Maybe he didn't need all the answers. Maybe faith wasn't about knowing for certain. It was about believing in something greater, something beyond explanation. He had trusted in that voice, and it had led him to a miracle. Whatever it had been, it had brought them both back from the brink. And that was enough. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a new routine. James continued to recover, gaining strength with each passing day. He started returning to some of his normal activities, playing video games, talking to his friends, and even going on short walks with David around the neighborhood. The pall of uncertainty that had hung over their lives for so long was lifting, replaced by a tentative hope for the future. But even as things returned to normal, David couldn't fully shake the questions that lingered in the back of his mind. The voice, the miracle, had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the house, David found himself sitting on the porch, watching the world go by. The street was quiet, the soft hum of distant traffic the only sound in the background. James had gone to bed early, still tired from his recovery, and David was left alone with his thoughts. He thought about Anne, about the letter she had left him, about the dream she had described and how eerily it had mirrored their reality. He thought about the voice, calm, soothing, and full of promise, and how it had pulled him through his darkest moments. He thought about faith, about the thin line between belief and doubt, and how close he had come to losing everything. David leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure he ever would. But maybe that was the point. Maybe faith wasn't about knowing for sure. It was about trusting in the unknown, in the things that couldn't be explained. The voice had saved them. That much was clear. Whether it was, and watching over them from beyond, or something else entirely, it didn't matter. What mattered was that David had believed. He had trusted when all reason told him not to, and that trust had been rewarded. As he sat there, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves, David felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He didn't need to know all the answers. He didn't need to explain the unexplainable. All he needed was the knowledge that James was safe, that he had been given a second chance. That was enough. David opened his eyes, gazing out at the quiet street. The sky was painted with soft hues of pink and orange, and the world seemed to be holding its breath in quiet reflection. For the first time in what felt like forever, David felt truly at peace. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of his mind, he thought he heard a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but filled with the same calm promise that had carried him through the storm. Everything will be all right. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what part of the story impacted you the most. Was it the father's leap of faith, the mysterious voice, or the miraculous recovery? Also, we're always looking for new ideas. So if you have a story you'd like to see brought to life, share your suggestions in the comments below. Your input helps shape the stories we create, and we can't wait to hear from you.